So, welcome to the second day of the conference on media freedom in volatile environment. I'm glad to see such a full room at an early hour, and I hope that is because the issue of safety of journalists that we're going to discuss in the next session is a very important one. And there are some very impressive panelists who will share with you their own experiences, mostly, their knowledge of attacks against journalists in their countries and around the world, the causes behind them, and what has been done so far to address them and stop this phenomenon, what has worked. What I hope to get out of today's session is really, hopefully, only further to raising awareness once again. Violence, harassment, journalists who carry out their job in very professional ways have to face. But also to look at some of the good practices. What have journalists done successfully? What have other civil society organizations done? And mostly, what do member states and state institutions need to do in order to address this issue, which is vital to the protection of media freedom and freedom of expression. Let me introduce very briefly the panelists. On my right, Sasha Lekovic. He's the president of the Croatian Journalists Association, I think one of the best-known journalists across the Balkans. Attacks against journalists are a daily reality for him, not only because of the support he provides to the colleagues through the associations, but also because chairman of Frontline Club, I was made aware that apparently there is fake news on his name shield. Former professor of international journalism, City University, London. He has been engaged also with the Freedom Forum, a very important organization, for many years. And I believe John started talking about journalist safety probably 20, 25 years ago, if not longer. So I look forward to hearing what the world has learned in the past decades. And to my further left, Erol Onderoglu, also one of Turkey's most respected, not only journalists, but also press freedom advocates. He's the representative in Turkey of Reporters Without Borders. He has done a lot to ensure the safety of his colleagues, and again, himself has been victim of attacks that I look forward to hearing about. John, let me start with you, if I may, and maybe provide some perspective to the issue of safety. You've been involved in this discussion for over 20 years, and today there is a general feeling that journalism has become more dangerous than ever. It's also the issue of safety has been addressed in different international fora and at the national level. Do you think that journalists and media organizations have taken steps to address safety? And do you think we're going in the right direction? Are we looking at the right solutions for this problem? Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Well, we start today with some very grim news. Journalists have been killed. A Kurdish journalist, Bakhtiar Haddad, was killed in Mosul. 3 French journalists badly wounded, a bomb planted, hitting them. And what is such a routine occurrence is with us again. So this should be against the backdrop of almost every week we are told about either a threat to a journalist or an attack on a journalist or, sadly, a death of a journalist. And again, how much attention this will get is also one of the continuing challenges for all media, mainstream media, because too often it is a side issue. You have to look to find it. It's on a CPJ alert that I get almost every day, the Committee to Protect Journalism. So to your question, is it safer? All I know is I go back 20 years to a gathering much smaller than this, but one of the first gatherings to talk about safety in journalism. And it was a time when newspapers and broadcasters didn't want to address this. They didn't want to welcome unions because they feared it was some sort of Trojan horse about getting representation through safety. There was a lot of animosity. And there was also a very strong voice in the room in my forum 20 years ago, and it was a colleague of yours. It was Robert Menard. This was before he became, I think, the nationalist mayor of Béziers. But he reminded everybody in that room, it is not the deaths of international journalists that should be spotlighted, it was local journalists. He pointed out that in Algiers, 60 journalists had died, 120,000 people had been killed, and the war had not been reported on, for the most part, except amongst French media. But in the English language world, if you probably Googled the coverage, you would find very little coverage of the Algerian conflict and war. So he made that point, and that's also the issue we face today. Also in that room, Kate Adie talking about the dangers of technology and worrying about how they were targets when they took their big satellite trucks out on assignment, and what were they going to do to get around that. Also, it was right after John Schofield, the BBC reporter, had been killed. And it's, again, reminded us that when an international journalist is killed, news organizations do pay attention and do try to figure out ways to respond. In this case, the BBC, led by a man named Chris Kramer, started organizing safety in journalism courses. All journalists were required to go through them. And today, as then, the BBC is the leader in this area. Several other quick changes, though. At that point, journalists could get to stories, however nasty the Balkans conflicts were, however nasty Chechnya was, someone wanted to talk to a reporter because they thought it was in their interest to have it reflected, their story told. So journalists would take those risks. It could be someone like the late Marie Colvin going to Sri Lanka to get to the Tamil Tigers and getting nearly blinded to try to tell the story of the Tamil Tigers. But she knew she wanted to get there, and she knew that it would be reported, and she knew that the world would pay attention. Now, of course, in a post-9/11 world, in a post-Iraq war world, in an ISIS world, we know that journalists are not wanted. The narrative is organized by these terrorist groups. They don't need journalists except for money. They're portable ATMs. And so they're valuable not as tellers of truth, but they're valuable as hostages, as we all know. And so today, we now are at a point where also, because of the changes in media, big news organizations are no longer sending their own people because of the dangers to cover these stories. The burden, as it was, but never accepted, falls on freelancers, the fixers, the media workers, and the local journalists. And then when the story gets big, of course, the big organizations will move in. And yet, major organizations still have not fully accepted their responsibility to train the fixers, freelancers, to provide protective gear. I talked to a prominent German television reporter the other day who said, yes, I can get gear, I can get the training, but if I hire someone locally, it's a real battle to try to get the bean counters in my home office to pay for protective equipment or to make sure that they have insurance. That issue has never gone away. So we are at a point, all the CPJ statistics RSF statistics remind us that it's more perilous than ever to be a journalist, and that again, as we know, 90% of the casualties will be local journalists pursuing stories about corruption. A study was done recently by the Global Investigative Journalism Network. 20% of the deaths of journalists were related to reporting on corruption in local areas. Something like 13 cases have been solved in the period of time that they've been studying this. So the Frontline Club, which I'm proud to chair, is in the middle of something we'll talk about, the freelance registry, and doing something about a culture of safety. And the mission is to better equip freelancers, better provide training, embolden them to do their work with the full support of the public and to get the recognition they desperately deserve. But it's dangerous, as this tragic death reminds us today. It's more deadly than ever out there.
Thank you, John. You mentioned that journalism is more dangerous than ever. It looks like we are losing this battle. And I want to understand what are the causes behind this phenomenon and how can we reverse these trends. Sasha, let me turn to you. John mentioned also the fact that journalists have started being targeted. And I remember probably the conflict in the Balkans was one of the first instances where the war was being played on the propaganda level. So to control the information was vital. And suddenly journalists lost their status of not only of civilians, but of neutral observers. Today, many people don't know it. Attacks against journalists are still very frequent in countries very close to Austria. We look at attacks in Italy, across the Balkans, in Spain. What is the cause behind those? What can be done to stop those attacks?
First of all, I feel actually pretty comfortable to speak about attacks on journalists, for example, in Croatia, sitting at the same table with people from Ukraine or Turkey, and having in the same room representatives or journalists or people from other countries where journalists are killed on a daily basis and put in jail. But what I'd like to say, what I think that's the main problem in Croatia now. For example, we have in Croatia something very interesting, but it's not something invented in Croatia. We had something like that in some other countries in the region. Now we have sort of a nationalistic clerical project which is actually against every independent media and journalist with integrity. And that's the main problem in Croatia right now, because they developed also, established some media who are working against media freedom, against journalists, sorry. And we have a pretty stupid situation that some journalists or so-called are working against the press freedom, against the real journalist. Other problem is because our governments are not stable, not just in Croatia but in some other countries in the region, and they don't have any idea to protect journalists at all. For example, we as a Croatian Journalists Association covering all attacks on journalists, not just physically, but all attempts to interrupt to the journalist work, and we have support from OSCE, for example, for all international organizations who actually cares for human rights and for journalist safety, but our government still stay silent on that. Ignorant, and that's something with what happens in some other countries. In some countries, maybe governments are more violent than in Croatia. We had ex-government lasted less than 1 year. They were very militant. Right now we have a government which is not acting like that, but the problem still stays the same, even worse, because they never repaired what damage happened a year ago.
Thank you for that, Sasha. Let me turn to Errol and look at slightly different type of safety concerns. All resolutions passed by the Human Rights Council, even at the OSCE level, look at safety, understand safety not only related to physical attacks, but to a number of other attacks against journalists. Turkey today is the country with the highest number of journalists held in prison, over 150. Many others are free on bail, waiting for trial, as Errol. Clearly this challenges the profession. It challenges the ability to produce independent, critical journalism. I understand that the journalistic community in Turkey has come together around these attacks, the latest one. Errol, what is your experience? Is this true, and has this been successful?
Thank you very much, Barbara. Thank you very much to OSCE Freedom of Media Office for making possible this conference. I'm honored to be among you. I would like to pay tribute to our Kurdish and French journalists. There are 2 journalists killed in Mosul. 2 other French journalists are wounded. Yeah, it's an opportunity to think about them. I think that we are witnessing an unprecedented crackdown in Turkey, not only toward what seems to be independent journalism or independent coverage, but as a wider manner against human rights movement, civil society organization, the secular heritage built over the last decades in Turkey. I think that there is a clear attempt to liquidate the human rights movement, as if Turkey will never need a human rights sensitivity in the future. So I understand in which extent international advocacy groups or Turkish journalist organizations are able to build coalitions or gatherings or assistance movement toward those who are deeply affected. But I think that comparing the level of the target, it is not enough. It is not enough because during my 2 decades career, it's the first time that I witness journalists from very diverse political view forced to exile. So there are dozens to leave the country, trying to build some kind of independent online website based in Berlin, based in Cologne, and other capitals of Europe. Of course, those who want to work properly in Turkey, the situation is much more, how to say, dramatical, in a sense that we just have a couple of small newspaper from very different political view. Cumhuriyet, a secular one; Evrensel, leftist one; Democracy, pro-Kurdish one. But let's say that the impact of all these newspapers altogether is very limited, and their journalists are on constant judiciary threat. So today more than 20 journalists, prominent journalists from different views, are not awaiting any decision from Turkish judiciary, but the one of European Court of Human Rights to get released. Most of them are behind bar, have been arrested just after the state of emergency put in place after the coup attempt last year, and they are remain behind bar for more than 10 months. So I should pay tribute to salute Kadri Gürsel, the head of IPI Turkey, a very good friend of us. He was the one who demonstrated for my release when I was shortly jailed last year today. We were all together fighting for the release of Can Dündar when himself was in jail 2 years ago. So it's a serial of very positive advocacy movement, but unfortunately for today, I cannot be so optimistic, and we are witnessing to unprecedented crackdown in Turkey, and of course we will see. I think Turkey today is trying to propose, wants to get rid of international commitment in terms of human rights at the UN level, at the OSCE level, at the European Council level, and is clearly challenging all with all these standards, and try to propose something else than what appears commitment in terms of human rights. Trying to propose geostrategical sustainability and try to propose something else than respect to, what is on human rights. And of course, Turkey needs to be understood. Of course, we should have we should realize the impact of, let's say, Fethullah Gülen structure over the last decades, and what kind of impact these political structures may have within the state apparatus, etc., etc. But I think that what we are witnessing today is further far from what seems to be proportional. And it's clearly the case for journalists who have built their career close to Fethullah Gülen, media outlets close to Fethullah Gülen. We should make a clear distinction between what is clearly evoking political views, writing on corruption, criticizing the government, etc., etc., and what is clearly be involved in political structures accused for being responsible of a coup attempt. But I think that the main damages created over the last 2 years is the one made in to judiciary. And Turkish judiciary is entirely control of the government, and even today, even one prosecutor and one judge wants to bring a positive rulings for a journalist in jail or in any case related to media. They are afraid of taking this positive step. I think I should limit my first speech there, but I would be happy to reply to your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harold. Yeah, and I think the concerns you have highlighted have been repeatedly mentioned also not only by the OSCE Office on Freedom of the Media, by the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression after his visit to Turkey last year, concerns that go beyond the attacks against the press and are challenging the entire system. And as you say, they're challenging our European fundamental rights, the rights that, and the commitment that OSCE member states have signed on to. So that is really what we are risking to lose. Let me turn to another very challenging situation in the OSCE area. Sergei, the conflict, the situation seems to be slightly calmer today than it was 2 years ago, but nevertheless, I understand journalists are still under immense pressure. Again, we talked in the Balkans as a war that was fought on the propaganda level, so suddenly journalists were treated like soldiers. Is this what you have experienced in Ukraine?
Well,
good morning. Yes, indeed. For the third year in a row, we have war in Ukraine, and it has presented new challenges for our profession. This includes kidnapping of journalists and holding them captive. It includes other risks of death of journalists on the front line, and something new as well, journalists who are themselves leaving occupied and annexed territories of Donbass and Crimea. In my presentation, I want to tell you about the current problems due to the war and also to focus attention on the domestic situation, the problem of the physical threat to journalists. Now, I would like to call upon colleagues not to politicize this problem, because yesterday and perhaps today we feel a kind of tension in the air, and some individual conference participants have used this forum for political or propaganda statements. For us, the topic of safety is a top universal priority, so I would appeal to everyone to use this important forum. It is an international platform, and we should be talking about the most relevant problems today in Ukraine with regard to the physical safety of journalists. Unfortunately, Ukraine is part of countries that have a partly free press. The biggest organization of journalists have said this, and we agree with this, that in fact that we only have partly we have freedom in journalists from Freedom House. Threats, intimidation, harassment, and even murder is an everyday thing. And what's worst is most of the crimes against journalists have not been resolved. We don't see the authorities looking into this, investigating it at the proper level, and we see impunity against crimes against journalists. And this, of course, leads to new crimes. Now, at the beginning of this month, in Donetsk, which is not controlled by Ukraine, the Stanislav Aseev, a journalist, disappeared. He was writing under the pseudonym of Vasin in that newspaper. We contacted the OSCE office representative to make sure that the special monitoring mission in Donetsk should try to find Stanislav Aseev. We want to know from the authorities that control Donetsk, is he alive? Where is he? And what is happening to him? We would like to perhaps provide Stanislav Aseev with legal assistance. The experience of our union of journalists in Ukraine in freeing journalists from captivity has shown that when this information is publicized, we often help save the lives of these journalists. So I appeal to all participants today to show us solidarity and to help us spread the information about this colleague who has disappeared. We also have contacted representatives and colleagues from the Union of Journalists of Russia so that we could have a joint statement of solidarity with our colleague. And I do hope that during today's session we can agree the text of the statement and could show greater attention and our overall solidarity with our colleague who has disappeared. If we are to talk about the overall reaction with regard to the events in Donbass, the main thing we see for us with regard to successes or our priority projects is solidarity with journalists who have been captured, to raise awareness, and also international assistance in attracting international partners. Another important project is the security dialogue that we have between the two unions of journalists in Ukraine and Russia, and we use this as a tool to help journalists who have found themselves in these difficult situations. One of the participants here today is Valery Makiev, who spent 100 days in captivity in the occupied territory of Lugansk. Here you can see the cover of his autobiography, a book that he wrote, where he tells about himself and another journalist that spent 132 days in captivity. And one of the reasons for his free liberation was our international project for solidarity. And here I am very proud to have Valery Makiev here with us today. Distinguished colleagues, in a month, on the 20th of July, we will be marking 1 year where in the center of Kiev, Pavel Sheremet was killed. He was blown up in his car when he was going to present a program on the radio. For 11 months now, no one has been convicted, no one has been arrested. There are no suspects. We have empty promises from the authorities saying that they're looking into it. But we have seen that investigation has made many critical errors. The investigators, the journalists of my union, have looked into it themselves. We have seen new video recordings from where the crime took place in the center of Kiev, and we have new witnesses, representatives of the authorities of Ukraine. Only after these new facts, the investigators found time to meet with the journalist who looked into this and requested to meet with this new witness. Another important and very current problem for us is to control and to look at the situation of earlier murders. 3 years ago, everyone remembers, in Ukraine, thanks to mass protests, we had a change of power. But over the 3 months of Euromaidan, when we did have a change of government, and during the mass protests, based on our data, over 270 journalists perished, mainly due to outrages and the beatings of the power authorities and the previous government. But Vyacheslav Virmy also was killed, and no one has been arrested or punished. And the death of this journalist Virmy, the main suspect, has been released. This case is basically collapsing right now. It is not being investigated. Here is an infographic where we have established facts and seen that 271 journalists suffered from physical aggression. There were 9 people who had been arrested, 31 threats of physical abuse, and 14 articles in the media. This was by the end of 2013, early 2014. Unfortunately, though, we have nobody being punished, and no one has been convicted of violating the rights of journalists. Here is the cover of a special magazine called Victims of Impunity that was prepared by our journalists union in Ukraine. Here is one other case which shows us what's going on. So this is a poster. You can see this terrible photo, which clearly illustrates that our photojournalist was very terribly beat up by the police. But the new prosecutor general has established the names of 40 policemen who had beaten or were present during these cases of abuse, and the new prosecutor general is basically removing from responsibility every one of these policemen. Another sign of our current impunity in the country. Now, how do the authorities look into crimes against journalists? In 2015, the Penal Code of Ukraine included new articles of crimes against journalists. Now we have punitive measures not only in hampering journalists' work, but also in threatening their lives, kidnapping them, and threatening journalists. Unfortunately, the practice of investigating actual criminal acts has not improved. The system closes their eyes to many different crimes. Everything is being slowed down, and the investigation is of very poor quality. We do not have any success stories. We have nothing to be proud of in saying that we have punished someone and established some kind of justice. One more situation. Amongst us today, once again, we have Sergei Gus, our colleague and editor from the Dnepropetrovsk region, whose car was burned down. We contacted on many occasions the authorities at the international level as well. This is from our union, is that in the Dnipropetrovsk region, we have an untenable situation. Over the past year, cars had been burned of 5 journalists or editors, and Sergei Gus was one of them. No reaction, no progress has been seen, and once again, it is impunity. Once again, we have another colleague here from today from the city of Berdansk, where we also had a terrible situation, absolutely unacceptable. Last year, right under the noses of the police, a whole television crew was beat up. The prosecutors closed their eyes and refused to take on this complaint from the journalist. Now, the Council of Europe and other partners are looking into this right now, and we still hope that we will find the perpetrators and they will be punished, and we see some progress here. Now, if we look at all of the data that we have, out of the 92% of crimes against journalists, out of 192% have not been investigated and have not come to trial. In those rare cases where the courts actually do come out with some decision, then the sentences really look ridiculous. For beating a journalist, breaking their cameras, the court decides to fine them for $20 or $50. Our conclusion to that is that it is cheaper to beat a journalist in Ukraine than to go to court. Now, how does our Union of Journalists combat impunity? We have conducted a broad national campaign together with our partners from the International Federation of Journalists. We are trying to attract attention from the mass media so that society can know about this, so that we can put in as many stories on into the public eye as much as possible. We have discussions on journalist safety. We involve international partners, and we are still continuing to put pressure on the authorities to really look into investigating these crimes. This slide, we also would like to very much thank the OSCE office. This year we held 3 major discussions in Odessa, Kharkiv, and Zaporozhye on journalist safety. We had up to 100 participants. So all journalists are very much interested in this very vital problem. Now, when we look at these modern challenges, we have created a special fund for the support of journalists who have suffered due to the war in Donbas and the annexation of Crimea. This includes people who had been killed captive and also those who have been displaced or are refugees amongst journalists. We've also observed that one way to fight impunity, in fact, the only way to fight impunity is to have public awareness. And we are demanding holding a parliamentary hearing on the safety of journalists and freedom of speech. We would like to ask President Poroshenko, who recently, on the 6th of June, the Day of Journalists, talked about the public accountability with regard to the law enforcement agencies. And we think that this accountability should be a parliamentary hearing. And if we are successful in doing this on the 2nd of November, which is our day to combat impunity against journalists, it will be a success for us. And the reporting to parliamentary should be on a regular basis, at least once a year. The issue of impunity should be raised at the highest level possible of the parliament and the president. This is the only way we will be able to make any kind of headway. Also, I would like to draw your attention to the most burning issue of the day. We are continuing to our fight to free Roman Yurchenko, who is illegally being held in Moscow. We are continuing to demand from the Russian authorities that they should stop persecuting Nikolai Siminu, a Crimean journalist. They are trying to sue him due to his publications. Now, this is a sign of freedom, and I would like to call upon all colleagues to express solidarity. We need to join our forces to free Roman Yurchenko and Nikolai Siminu. Let me just say once again that, unfortunately, impunity is a major problem in Ukraine, which unfortunately doesn't allow our journalism or journalists to develop, and it raises the issue of self-censorship. But we are doing everything in our power to make progress and to make sure that the perpetrators are held accountable. At the end, now I would like to just say that safety of journalists is not an issue for political speculations. I would like to suggest that here we shouldn't try to count how many journalists have been killed in Ukraine or killed in Russia. The issue of journalist safety is not a political discussion. This is a question of a safe environment for journalists in all countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sergei. I couldn't agree more. And also, let me take this opportunity to commend the efforts that you and the Ukraine Union has done to join in dialogue with the Russian Union of Journalists under the auspices of the OSCE representative. I had the honor of participating in some of these meetings, and I was really greatly impressed by the skills and the ability to keep the conversation strictly on journalistic principles, on rights, beyond whatever are the pressures you receive from home. So really congratulations for that. Sasha, let me get back to you. Sergei has mentioned a lot about, has spoken a lot about impunity. Impunity as the core cause of attacks against journalists. We know, we have discussed impunity a lot. We know that the cause for impunity is not a lack of resources or a lack of skill, is a lack of political will. I understand that is a problem in your part of the world as well. What can be done about it?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. For example, in my country, in Croatia, we can say that we don't have let's say, pretty good laws about that. But the problem is because there's no political will. For example, we don't, fortunately in Croatia, not counting the 90s war in the region, we have just one journalist killed, just one, I mean it's much, of course. One journalist killed 9 years ago, but we have another one the same year beaten almost to death, and that case is still not solved. But what we are doing, we are saying all the time, very, very loudly and publicly, that there shouldn't be cold cases when it comes to the attacks on journalists. We have many threats. For example, I will give you my example. I'm a journalist for 38 years, and most of my life I'm covering organized crime cases, like human trafficking and that kind of stuff. And I used to be also the war reporter during the 90s. But I was never faced with so many threats, including death threats, like in the last 2 years when I became president of the Croatian Journalists Association. That's the reason why I started answering on the way I did. Not because of any political politics in mind, but most of the cases, almost non-case of threats of journalists or physically abused journalists are not solved in Croatia. We have just rare situations where cases are, let's say, closed, but just because the people treated journalists very publicly. And actually, you shouldn't be a very good policeman or investigator or prosecutor to find out what's going on. But even that, in that cases, punishment is pretty bad, I think. You know, no one gets in jail only when someone threats you, but death threats. some journalists actually treated that way. That guys, if they're not still anonymous, they get in jail like for 1 month because of the investigation. But after that, no one was like actually punished to be put in jail. And then that happened just in few cases. But most cases are still not resolved. Of course, most of them are done anonymously. And if someone attacked you or send you death threats anonymously by social networks, sometimes it's not easy to find out who does that. But from my perspective, because I'm working with that cases as president of the association, neither police or prosecutors are not really involved to do so. Something which could help, which helps, is the of course joint actually actions. You have to be supported by other organizations, not just in your country, but regionally. For example, Croatian Journalists Association is a Croatian partner in a regional project which actually works with attacks on journalists, and 6 countries are involved. Some of our partners are today in this room, and we not just counting cases, we are going from the very first beginning to the end, every day trying to find out what's going on, pushing the officials to do the work, and we have a mechanism how to put that information even worldwide if it's possible. For example, the last case was when 6 journalists were attacked in Serbia during the inauguration of the president. Before that, 1 journalist in Croatia were beaten by a mayor of one little town, and we send all that information not just within that 6 countries, but also to OSCE, to UN, to European Union and European Commission addresses, and that helps to get support from outside. But as I said before, problem is because local officials they are acting all the time that something not happening here.
Thank you. International pressure as a remedy, as one of the possible remedies. Let me go back to Errol on also impunity is a problem in Turkey as well. I understand, I remember the case of Hrant Dink. More recently, you mentioned Can Dündar. In the case of Can Dündar, my understanding is that the person who attacked him, the person we all saw on video with a gun in his hand, standing in front of him, is free to walk pending trial, while a lot of our colleagues, journalists, are sitting in jail and have yet to be brought in front of court. How does international pressure work in Turkey, or what can be done about impunity?
Barbara, I believe that we still have a wonderful network in terms of solidarity with international advocacy groups, journalistic organizations. And I think that what will get impact 5 years ago, today is not enough to push the government to take the good path. I think that in Turkey, over all the time, crime against journalists and fight against impunity were altogether politically motivated. Let's take the example of Hrant Dink. He was a wonderful friend who was pushing for negotiations, reconciliations between Turkish and Armenian societies. And he was shot dead at the city center of Istanbul 10 years ago. At the beginning, Turkish judiciary and government has made these murder cases one of the serial attack operated by secular Ergenekon outlawed organizations. So it was perceived as one of the actions attempt to destabilize the government of Erdogan. Last year, the government has defined these murder cases in an indictment released against Fethullah Gülen movement. And they arrested more than 30 civil servants, intelligence agents or police officers from Trabzon, etc., etc. So once you want to fight against impunity against journalists, you have to be credible and not be politically motivated. What happened about the attackers of Can Dündar was primarily encouraged by political speeches. You know, Can Dündar, Ahmet Hakan, who was a presenter of CNN Turks. All these attacks happened after a hostile environment encouraged by a spokesperson of the government. And the impression led to this conservative circle is that, oh, they don't deserve to be alive. In fact, they are our enemies. And you know, if you really really loved your country, you should get rid of all these journalists, secular journalists. Very widely, the impunity is guaranteed from the beginning. So I think that it's not necessary to talk about impunity in these circumstances. Of course, what Turkish government tried to let as impression widely is not sustainable. It's not, you know, it's signing paper, signing reform at Brussels, at UN level, and to encourage the country on the ground is not credible at all. Comparing the figure shown for Euromaidan in Ukraine and the one for Gezi massive protest in Istanbul in 2013 are quite similar. More than 180 representatives of Turkish and foreign media were targeted and were attacked when covering this massive demonstration in June 2013, remain unpunished in Turkey. No one police officer was prosecuted, was tried because of targeting journalists. Some police officers have proceeded to passport check when a CNN international reporter was on live in Taksim Square. And finally, I think that there is a few number of cases, of compensation cases. The Turkish Interior Minister is sanctioned to pay some compensation of 2 or 3 reporters beaten during this coverage. I should be grateful to this international movement, IPI, CPJ, Amnesty International, very IFEX network, very strong network who have obtained my release last year. I was just released 10 days before the coup attempt and the state of emergency. The impact that I provide my release is not enough today to do more or to obtain more for our colleagues behind bar. I think that it is we should do more, yes, but I think that most of that we need an international political actor able to convince Turkish government to take the correct path. You know, at the beginning, Barbara, in the past, I remember that we were all the time evoking, when it's come to prevent a main conflict in the world, I remember that we were hearing about Ahti Atisari, Yashar Kemal, very prominent actors intervening to conflict, intervening in major political issue. And I remarked that, I noticed that today we don't have such prominent figures able to put an end to Kurdish conflict, to put an end or other sensitive areas, and to have a weight when they call for the release of journalists and they underline human rights abuses, etc., etc. I think that impunity has been a major issue in the past, but particularly when Turkish government put an end to peace negotiations with Kurdish political movement in July 2015. And then, of course, what appears to be coup attempt, state of emergency, decree laws, etc., it's much more difficult to underline the importance of impunity, because everything is led to administration, not to judiciary. Judiciary today is bypassed by decree laws and by administrative measures. So I think that, yes, we need, it's much more difficult nowadays to give a lesson or to advise something to Turkey when international diplomatic rules have changed. And that's an opportunity for authoritarian governments, dictatorships to choose their way and to challenge the fundamental values that we are all trying to defend. I think that the conjuncture, this process is unfortunately not benefit to what we are trying to achieve. Yeah.
Thank you, Era, for that. Before I turn to John, let me agree with what at least 3 of our 4 panelists so far have mentioned about the need of a strong international voice to stand up for the rights of the media and the rights of journalists, and calling on member states, OSCE member states present in this room, on the urgency to appoint a new special representative on freedom of the media. Dunja has been that voice, a very powerful and previous representative as well, and that mandate is urgently needed. John, let me turn to you, and following up on what our colleagues have presented from the realities they face at the local level. Do you feel the news media does a good job in raising awareness, in covering attacks? Should more be done? What is your opinion on that? Thank you.
Before I answer that, I do want to say, however, there is one voice that is being heard rather loud and clearly in terms of encouraging impunity. That happens to be the voice of the President of the United States. And to echo what Kate Adie said, his remarks about journalism being the enemy of the people, and his cozying up to Mr. Erdogan, to al-Sisi in Egypt, to Duterte in Philippines, to Mr. Putin, and more recently to the Saudis and what he has set in motion in the Gulf states. All of that is completely horrific, what he has managed to accomplish in a short period of time. I acknowledge I worked for Al Jazeera English for several years, so I care about what's going on in that journalism, but already what he has done by targeting Al Jazeera through the Gulf states, and also leading to, for example, journalists who post anything critical of Qatar online in Abu Dhabi and the Emirates can now be arrested. He has been a major force in, of course, continuing impunity. So that's, as the Economist points out, that voice is gone. And by the way, the publisher of the Los Angeles Times was recently in Germany because he wanted to talk to Chancellor Merkel about intervening with Turkish journalists because the Los Angeles Times publisher obviously cannot go to the President of the United States for any kind of support and assistance, and that is tragic. Do journalists do enough to cover the plight of journalists who are in trouble or when they've been detained or held hostage? They do when it's an international journalist. When there is a celebrated case, the French are incredibly good about spotlighting that. The British have been excellent. The BBC, when Alan Johnston was held hostage, ran story after story after story. Many countries whose journalists have been taken won a blackout. My old CBC had a journalist held underground in Afghanistan for months, and they wanted no publicity. So it does vary. Again, when local journalists are in trouble, I don't think there's enough reporting on their situation. More recently, again, if you look at the Al Jazeera 3 in Egypt, that got worldwide attention. So I think it's a rather inconsistent picture. But again, if it's stringers, we go back to the point of the Italian journalist in Afghanistan who was released after a long negotiation, but his stringer or media assistant was murdered because there was no outrage in Italy to free him. So again, this is an inconsistent picture. And another thing journalists can do is band together. I mean, the IFJ, NUJ has been doing this for decades, but there are projects now where journalists come together not to forget what has happened. Right now, after the death of a journalist in Mexico named Javier Valdez, journalists finally are trying to figure out if there's some way they can try to stop this. After all, there have been 104 journalists killed there, 6 in March, so it continues to be a terrible place. There are other projects that have been tried, one in the United States called the Chauncy Daily Project, where an Oakland, California publisher was murdered, and again, journalists banded together to try to expose a Muslim bakery project that was behind the killing of this journalist, and they did so, and he went to prison. So I think journalists themselves are working more closely together. The other big issue is, of course, the IMF and the World Bank. And the Global Journalism Network has made it very clear they think that the IMF and the World Bank ought to do more to deny funding or to provide more strings attached if those countries continue to punish and jail and abuse journalists.
Thank you, John. And I would add to that other than joining together in raising awareness, in some cases journalists have come as far as joining together to carry out investigations that state institutions should have done, but because of the failure of the states to do so, the journalists have gone into doing that in order to address the cases, the crimes against their colleagues. I would like to open it now to questions from the floor. I was given the power of the gong. You have 2 minutes at most to ask your questions. I would like to encourage you to remain on the topic of safety of journalists and look for solutions. Thank you. Sorry, the gentleman on my left and then the one on my right and one in the back.
Yes, I would like to ask Mr. Owen. He mentioned the IMF and to put pressure. Why do the IMF would do that?
They have the power when...
Yes, but why? What is their motive? I mean...
Well, if the IMF's ultimate purpose is to try to maintain democratic countries that have capitalistic bases, then certainly the fourth estate is a fundamental part of a democracy, and therefore the requirements to keep journalists out of harm's way ought to be a condition for financing. In the same way, they're looking at every other economic indicator. Why should it not be as routine a requirement as any other economic requirement indicator?
Thank you.
Because we are not used to this by IMF or these
Th-
organizations.
Thank you, but yeah. Please introduce yourself before asking the questions. 1, 2, 3.
My name is Yuri Lukanov. I'm a journalist from Ukraine. I cooperate with the Human Rights Information Center. Yesterday and today, two names were mentioned, the Ukrainian journalists who were arrested in, one of them, Roman Yurchenko, arrested in Russia, another one arrested in Crimea, which is a territory which is occupied by the Russian Federation. But I'd like to remind maybe that, or draw your attention that recently two new names appeared to citizens of Ukraine, journalists who are in prison now in Crimea, in occupied Crimea. It's Dmitro Shtiblikov and Alexei Basarabov. They were analytics of analytics center Nomus in Sevastopol. They were arrested and they were charged with terroristic attack, or preparing of terroristic attack. The fact is, before, for example, Mykola Semena, who is faced with the risk to be sent in prison for 5 years, he was charged with public call for disintegration of Russian territory. But now maybe it's a new tactic, because if the Russian, so-called Russian authority on territory of Crimea charge journalists with journalist activity, it's bad image and so on for the authority, I mean. But if you charge journalists with terroristic attack, it looks like truthfully, and maybe, but in fact, we understand that is violation of the freedom of speech. I want to remind you that he isn't a journalist, but he close to journalism. Documentary film director Oleg Sentsov was sent Crimean citizen of Ukraine, and he lived in Crimea. He was charged with preparing of terroristic attack and once sent to the prison for 20 years. Can you imagine, for 20 years?
Thank you.
I want to remind you, just one note, please. Okay. I want to remind you that Dunya Mijatovic, who is, he isn't here, she isn't here now, but last year she issued statement that she was going to manage a mission to Crimea, which would monitor freedom of speech. But unfortunately, the Russian authority prohibited access to this mission, and that's why this idea failed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A gentleman in the back.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Hacı Ali Açıkgül. I am coming from Turkey, Ministry of Justice. I am a judge. Also, I am head of Human Rights Department, in the Ministry of Justice. I represent my government before European Court of Human Rights. And I would like to use my right to reply rather than question. That's why I need some more time. First of all, I would like to underline that Turkey's commitment to democracy, human rights and rule of law, which are integral part of our domestic legal order. Since the coup attempt, we continuously keep informing our international partners. We maintain uninterrupted cooperation with international institutions, in particular the Council of Europe, the United Nations and OSCE. Just after the coup attempt, we started a high-level dialogue with the Council of Europe, which is, I am a member of this dialogue group, in addition to political one. Also, I would like to mention that many projects as regards to human rights has been carried out with the Council of Europe, with the cooperation of the Council of and European Union in Turkey. A freedom of expression project has been just completed 2 months ago. In scope of this project, over 2,000 judges and prosecutors have been trained in terms of European standards, including human rights case law, human rights courts case law. Also, Ministry of Justice has initiated another project with the Office of the Representative of Media Freedom, this section. So far, about 200 senior judges and prosecutors have visited the office and exchanged views. I would like to give another information in terms of judiciary. In Turkey, judiciary is independent and impartial. Execution or legislative organ has no influence on it. With the referendum took place in April this year, new provision has been brought to our constitution to strengthen the judiciary, which is impartiality of the judiciary. Madam Chair, Turkey needs to be understood, and Turkey faces severe and multiple terrorist threats and is now combating not only Fethullahist terrorist organization, we named it FETÖ, but also PKK, DHKPC and Daesh terrorist organization. The government of Turkey shows utmost care to strike a proper balance between fundamental rights and freedoms on the one hand and public order and security on the other. Security-freedom nexus is closely paid attention to in the context of democratic security in this society. On July 15, FETÖ members in the military attempt to overthrow our democratically elected government, the president and the constitutional order. Plotters massacred civilians, attacked the presidency, bombarded the parliament and tried to assassinate the president, causing the death of 249 persons, including 180 civilians. Also, over 2,000 people has been injured. Furthermore, in the course of PKK's terrorist campaign since July 2015, 343 civilians and 929 security personnel were murdered and over 2,000 civilians were wounded. Ongoing state of emergency in Turkey was necessary for measures to be taken in the most speedy and effective manner. Over the years, FETÖ elements, FETÖ members infiltrated into the state organs and misused public resources to serve the terrorist organization. They also established their own network in the private sector, academia, including the media, to finance their illegal goals. I would like to understand that FETÖ is not a traditional terrorist organization. They infiltrated into state institutions by concealing their real identity. They are some kind of secret organization. The investigations conducted on certain journalists after the coup attempt are not due to their journalistic activity, journalistic work, but due to their support or link to the terrorist organizations and employing their profession for criminal and terrorist activities. Certain FETÖ-linked media institutions were closed down in accordance with decree laws. The coup attempt posed a vital security threat to the Turkish nation. Accordingly, the judicial authorities considered it worthwhile to prosecute any support to the bloody coup, regardless of the profession of the supporters, as such acts constitutes crime. In this connection, I would like to stress again that under the international human rights law, nobody, no profession is immune from investigation when she or he commit a crime or if there is a reasonable suspicion about committing a crime. Furthermore, state of emergency measures are constantly reviewed. Boards have been established at Prime Minister and Governor offices across Turkey for those who believe they have been wrongfully suspected. To date, thousands of employees have been reinstated and over 300 institutions have been reopened. Moreover, as a consequence of our high-level dialogue with the Council of Europe, an inquiry commission on the state of emergency measures has been established as a binding legal remedy to address measures that are taken directly with decrees. The Commission will assess applications regarding dismissals of public employees, closure of associations, institutions, and media outlets. It is entitled to take binding decisions, and its decisions are also subject to judicial control. Commission members have been recently appointed and will soon start to receive applications. Also, the Strasbourg Court pointed out its decision last week the Commission is a domestic legal remedy to be exhausted. Madam Chair, I would like to underline again, rule of law, human rights and democracy are main principles of our constitution. Turkish government has a strong will to its international commitment, but democracy and human rights faced a very big threat in international, faced very big threat, and Turkey took measures to protect its democracy, human rights, and rule of law in line with international standards. Lastly, I would like to give information to all with our relations.
I need to ask you to wrap it up.
Last sentence. With civil society, Turkish government is open to all kind of objective, impartial, and constructive criticism. Representative of many civil society, including Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and other civil society organizations visit regularly my office and relevant governmental office when we exchange views. And thank you for attention.
Thank you for that. The gentleman on my left.
Спасибо. Я Алексей.
Thank you, Alexei Matsuko. I represent the Donetsk Institute of Information from Donetsk. It's a civil society organization. Right now, our organization is on the Ukrainian side of Donbass. But I was very touched by what the speakers today said regarding that the first victims in any conflict are local journalists. We have seen this ourselves. We have been witnesses of situations where journalists were targeted in Donetsk and in the Ukrainian side of Donbass as well, because the information with regard to assessing the military activities on both sides really annoys both sides. I have a question to Sasha from Croatia. He said that there is a conflict between loyal journalists, as I understood, those who are loyal to the government, and independent journalists who are trying to defend their right to inform the public as it should be. So how do you solve that situation? Aren't there some kind of alternative unions of journalists being formed? Because I understand your organization is some kind of alternative organization. And questions for some of the other speakers. John said that local journalists can form unions and come together. This is one of the ways to fight against crimes against journalists. Others talked about this as well. And my question is with regard to conflicts such as the one in Donbass. How can we try to work with journalists, for example, from Russia, who are in Donetsk, and their function is not really an information one, but what they're doing is spreading propaganda. You can see this if you watch Russian television. But the Ukrainian journalists in the Ukrainian side of Donbass often also have a militarized function rather than just providing information to the public. So how do both sides of this conflict, what can they do?
Let me get two more questions. If you would like to come up to the microphone. And I think on my left was the next one. Come up to the mic.
May I use that one? May I sit here? Hello, my name is Banu Güven. Well, I'm from Turkey, I'm a journalist. The channel I was working for was one of the last independent news channels in Turkey, and it was closed by a commission founded by one of the decrees following the coup. Well, the situation, I don't share the same opinion with you. since you're the head of the Human Rights Department in the Ministry of Justice, I would like to share my opinion and my experience as a journalist. It's never been the case that we have so many colleagues in jail, and the pre-trial detention goes beyond limits. The indictments come usually very, very late, and the accusations are unproportionate, strong. The evidences are made up. They are weak evidences, no evidences, and some of them are just only news. And well, they also are usually time-barred. That means they go beyond the statute of limitation. I think that you are going to face a lot of cases in Strasbourg and the Court of Human Rights, maybe including a case about the closure of our news channel, Image TV. Well, I would like to let you know about a case where a journalist, he is being held in Hakkari in prison. He was in solitary confinement. He is accused of being a member of a terrorist organization. Well, he was held in solitary confinement, I repeat. His first hearing was after 13 months of pre-trial detention, and there 12 out of 13 witnesses testified. They said that they had to testify against him under severe torture. The name of this person who is in jail is Nedim Turfent, and all the witnesses said that they were tortured. Many of them didn't know this young journalist at all.
Thank you for that.
And I would like to, I mean, it's a problem if we are talking about some evidences made up by torture against journalists. It's a huge problem. And as a head of the Human Rights Department in the Ministry of Justice, we are urging you to look at the situation. This person is still in jail. He wasn't released, but all the evidences, as we heard in the first hearing, were just made up under torture. Thank you very much.
One last question before I go back to the panelists. Yes.
Yes, my name is Borka Rudic. I'm coming from Association of BA Journalists, and I am Secretary General. I would like to share with you a very popular sentence in media community in Bosnia and Herzegovina. It is that we survived the war, but we don't sure that we can survive the peace. It means that we have a lot of challenges and problems with protection, freedom of expression, and media freedom in Bosnia and Herzegovina. In my association, we have a free media helpline as a special service for delivery of free legal and professional aid to journalists. On the early level, we registered 60 different cases, violation of journalist rights and media freedom in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Only 20% of those cases are solved in the favor to the journalists. My first point is that we need more pressure to local governments by international community to protect and to get in their hand their obligation for protect freedom of expression and the main human rights. My country and other countries in Western Balkan region are in the process to negotiation with the European Union. I think that all discussion, all meetings with our authorities must be under to protect freedom of expression and as a main human rights. Second my point is we need among media community and journalist community more solidarity with the journalists who have problem on daily basis in their local media. Last year, 3 organizations from Bosnia sent a protest letter to the Turkish government related to the error case After that, we had a lot of problems with our people in Bosnia and Herzegovina because we support Gulen's journalist in the Turkey. I was invited to the Turkish embassy in Sarajevo, and we discussed about our letter to the Turkish government. It wasn't acceptable for the freedom of expression in my country and other countries.
Thank you very much for that. I would like to offer an opportunity to the panelists to answer some of the questions, and okay, very short, if possible, really short, 1 and 2. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Yurchenko. I am a journalist from Crimea. I'm a migrant. 3 years ago, my family was forced to leave everything we had with 3 suitcases. We went to live in Kiev because we did not support the illegal annexation of Crimea by Russia. I just wanted to say today that we are talking about individual cases of violence against journalists. But today, right in our very eyes, we have examples of when it's become something complete and total and totalitarian. The Russian Federation in Crimea is harassing journalists. Journalists are being arrested. They're being kidnapped. They are being accused of unfounded crimes. They have taken over the media space. We are talking about displaced journalists. So in order to stay in the profession, we're forced to leave their homes. The journalists who want to maintain their dignity, but who cannot leave Crimea, they abandon their profession, and this is a very major tragedy for them, where you cannot do the job that you love. Yesterday, Sergei Gorbachev, a countryman of mine, represented himself as the head of the Union of Journalists of Sevastopol, but he forgot to say that he was a Russian citizen living in Ukrainian Sevastopol. He worked in a newspaper which belongs to the Russian army, and he even served in the Russian army. He said that in Sevastopol and in Crimea, there are no acts of violence against journalists. But we see this is not so. We have concrete examples. Andreevsky, Shtiblikov, Nikolai Semina prove that this is the case. We see a society where we don't have independent journalists, and this is a major tragedy. The people of Crimea constantly hear that Ukraine as a state does not exist, that there is a crisis in Europe due to refugees, migrants, and sexual perversion. They say that Russia has a country which is developing, and we're going to protect you from NATO and the United States. This is a major problem. I want to attract attention to it. What's happening in annexed Crimea is illegal, and we don't know exactly what this may lead to. Thank you. Secretary of the Union of Journalists, I'm touching that. I would like to reduce the tensions a little bit and to start talking in a format of dialogue that will be much more constructive. With regard to Crimea, I get the feeling that what we hear here today is not quite the truth, because there are 2 unions of journalists there in Sevastopol and in Crimea and in Simferopol. As regards Seminu, yes, it's true, and we're going to have an appeal on Mr. Semini, and we have done this already. Other stories about murder, kidnapping, none of this has been registered, and it just doesn't exist. That's the first thing. The second thing I wanted to say is that the Russian Union of Journalists has hundreds and thousands of journalists. They don't consider Crimea to be an occupied territory. They see it as another area that has decided to become part of Russia. That's the most important thing. So there's a difference here that we need to actually get a grip on. But now the most important thing. For 3 years, we have had a constant dialogue with the Union of Journalists of Ukraine. The fact is that we have journalists here who have been released and freed. They have been freed thanks to our joint appeal to do that. And also with regard to what's been talked about, someone who disappeared in Donetsk, we're also prepared to help that effort. But I just also wanted to say that over the past 3 years, we've had a very strange situation, because from the Russian media, we have 120 different sources from media sources from Russia don't have the right to work in Ukraine. And the other thing that really worries me as well, when the main media sources don't work, they are replaced by fake news. And we have a very bad situation as a result. And we start to attack each other. So the most important thing is to reestablish the opportunity for the traditional media to work in Ukraine. It's very important for the journalists in Ukraine to focus on this. And it seems to me that in the modern situation, something like the certain organizations that spread propaganda in the post-Soviet area is another opportunity to talk about that specific site and its opportunity to actually do away with these harmful sources.
Yes, very short, if I can. I represent the European Federation of Journalists, and я буду говорить по-русски.
I will be speaking in Russian. I support what I just heard from Sergei, in that we need to continue the dialogue that journalists are fighting for, and we are thankful to them. I wanted to remind you that 8 people were released as a result of the dialogue between Russian and Ukrainian journalists and professional organizations of journalists. And the fact that thanks to our joint efforts, we have prepared the statement to support this journalist who has disappeared is an opportunity to release him and to find him. Let's not forget that a dialogue is not just discussing issues. It's not even a discussion or a debate of ethical standards. It's an opportunity for us to support and save people. And let's hope that in the future we won't need to save people's lives, but for the time being that is the case. And I do hope that this work will continue. And the European Federation of Journalists supports the joint statement of the Union of Journalists of Ukraine and Russia to support a save that journalist.
Let me get back to the panelists. Unfortunately, we don't have any more time for the questions. Sasha, I'll start with you if you would like to answer some questions in a couple of minutes.
Yeah, first of all, Croatia, we in Croatia don't have the same situation as Donbas area has, because we are there's no war there anymore. We are not divided by territory or any other way. But Croatian Journalists Association, which I represent here, lasts for 160 years. We're changing like six countries, six sort of regime and governments. But what I was said about the parallel organization happened, as I already mentioned, happened. It's not invented in Croatia. It happened in many other countries all around the world. Almost 2 years ago, supported by the ex-government, a new parallel organization was established. But we're talking just about 20 or 30 members, and they are not really. They are journalists. Actually, they are working in media, but they are actually para-political organization, and they are just supporting government, doing and saying everything against the media freedom and against the journalism. But they have occupied public media service, and they're still there, and they have a room in the media, because media count them. Most of the media count them as a normal, let's say, professional organization, and that's the problem, because one of the results of that is that myself and members of my organization and other journalists who are doing their job very professional, we are receiving many threats, including the death threats, not mostly, but also because of that journalists are doing. Because they are doing exactly what they shouldn't do. That's everything against the media freedom, against the press, against the journalists. And that's the big problem, and it's not a problem just here. And I'll just conclude with one sentence, because sitting here and participating in this conference organized by the OSCE Representative Freedom of the Media Office, I would mention once again Dunja Mijatović, but because as you all know, we don't have now office, there's no representative right now. The problem is because the OSCE representative of freedom of media is the only one person who could, who can give us support, speaking loudly about specific cases. All other institutions, like from US to EU, they doing that just pretty much saying some basic principles and something like that. But only this representative of this office could do that, can do that, saying something about the real life cases, specific cases, and that's something what we miss still. And applied to all 57 members, country members of OSCE to give us a new representative as soon as possible, because it's very important for us. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Sasha. Sergey.
Спасибо.
Thank you, distinguished colleagues. I just wanted to also focus on a couple of things. When we make a statement with regard to the violation of the rights of journalists, we criticize our authorities. But I still think that our mission is not to make friends with officials and the government. Our mission is to defend our rights and to have a sound environment. But we do this outside of politics. If we focus on the topic of our project and taking part in the dialogue between journalist unions in Russia and Ukraine, once again, I want to clarify something. We are not at all talking about using the word friendship. Unfortunately, there is no friendship between Russian and Ukrainian dialogues. We have a dialogue, but when you have a friend, you don't really have a dialogue. What we're doing is we have some very careful contacts. For us, that's an opportunity. This is a tool to provide for security. It is a tool to help our colleagues who are being held captive. And this is a platform which has been acknowledged by international organizations. It is supported by the International Federation of Journalists that includes journalist unions from both countries. And so we are very grateful for the security dialogue. But friendship is something that maybe will be in the future, but I think it is far, far in the future. For now, we're just talking about safety and security. So we need to focus on that. And we, of course, do understand that dialogue is far from being simple. Ourselves and many journalists in Ukraine aren't always understand. Some people think that you can't sit around the same table with representatives from a country which is an aggressor, but we do sit at that table together only to help the journalists that need our assistance.
Errol, if you would like to make any final comment. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Barbara. What I can say about the complaint commission that Turkish embassy representative has just evoked, I should say that this complaint committee built 6 months ago has not treated one single cases of, for instance, media outlet close based on decree laws after the state of emergency. I think that it was last minute solution that Turkish government tried to find to avoid the pace European Council Parliamentary Assembly to monitor, to choose Turkey as a monitoring country. but I would like this commission be more efficient in treating, for example, TV channels closed under state of emergency. I would like to be very optimistic on the collaboration with the Turkish judicial system and European Council in training prosecutors and judges. But what about thousands of prosecutors and judges trained so far? Where are they? Why Turkish judiciary system is not able to rule respectfully to European Convention of Human Rights jurisprudence? So I think that thanks to Dunia Mijatović's efforts in 2014, more than 40 media representatives were released when they were serving, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years in jail, pending trial. So we should salute Dunia Mijatović's efforts, and this is why we need a very strong, as Dunia, a very strong figure at the head of the office today. And of course, I would be the one who would be very happy to see that Turkish government is in close, contact and with this office, because I clearly want this very alarming situation of journalists behind bars solved very rapidly. I would just take your statement not as a right perspective, but as a statement reflecting the general view of Turkish government. But we are, you are evoking the case of the close contact with Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, etc. But I should remind you that Turkish head of Amnesty International is jailed now for several weeks in Turkey. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I'm sorry for not being able to take more questions. Join me in thanking the panelists with a clap of hands. Thank you very much. Sorry, I forgot to mention that the coffee break will last half an hour, so the next session will be delayed for 50 minutes.